Hey creepy fam, so I'm going to keep this very brief. Today's video was supposed to be up early this morning. It's almost noon, but I wasn't able to get it up until now, so I'm very sorry. I've kind of told you guys that I've been dealing with depression, and my post-traumatic stress disorder has been extremely severe lately. It sounds like excuses, but honestly, it's honestly crippling some days, most days lately. So I do apologize. I hope you guys enjoy this second part. If you have not seen part 1, I suggest you watch part 1 first. It will be the first link in the description box down below, and also in a card up above. I love you so much. Thank you for being here, and thank you for 76,000 subscribers. I'm not worthy. I'm so sorry. I love you. Enjoy this video.
With a trail of dead bodies.
A lot of people put up a front. They put up this protective shield, and it is said that she was very protective of their bad times, which is why a lot of people didn't see this coming. They didn't really see what was about to transpire. So on January 31st, 1982, she left the party upset, and it is noted that that day, I want to read it so I don't misspeak, but she was wearing red sweatpants, which her friend found odd since Kathleen had often dressed in much better quality clothing. And she later left for South Salem, New York after a call from her husband. The very last time that any of her friends and family saw her was that night, and she left very upset. I guess she met up with Robert, according to him. Durst said that the couple did argue and fight like any other married couple, nothing out of the ordinary. And he maintained that his story was that he put Kathleen on a train to go to New York City. So then he said he had a drink with a neighbor and spoke to his wife by telephone later that evening. So one thing you need to know about Robert Durst is that he was notorious for making collect phone calls. Back in the day, there were these things called payphones. I think we still have payphones, but they're like a dinosaur. Even like a home phone, people don't really have that much anymore. But at a payphone, you could call somebody collect. And he said that he would often do this because, well, why pay for the phone call? Why not have the company pay for the phone call, sort of thing? It's also an easy way to make a phone call and not be at a place at a certain time, or have an alibi, if you will. So he says he called her and spoke to her. So that's what he told police. Later on, it is said in the documentary, he admits that he never had that drink with the neighbor. The neighbor did not corroborate his story. And the neighbor said, it's not like Robert even called me up and said, hey, by the way, I'm telling the police that I'm having drinks with you after I put Kathleen on a train to New York. Can you please lie for me? He didn't even ask that. For some reason, he just said that to the police. And I guess maybe he just assumed they would go away. He said in the documentary, and I quote, "That's what I told police. I was hoping that would just make everything go away." Now, when your wife is missing, reported missing, you don't want it to just go away. And I guess he waited a few days to call the authorities to even report her missing, because he said he did send her off on a train. And like I said, she was in medical school, and he did say firmly, he said, Kathleen ran off, she was seeing somebody else, they tried to paint her that she was doing drugs, you know, the cocaine, and that she was having an affair with another medical student, but that Kathleen would come back, and he was pretty certain of that because she wanted to get that doctorate. She was determined to be a pediatric doctor. And at the time, the officers they didn't really look at it with much concern. And Seymour Durst had nothing to do. He had no comment on his daughter-in-law's disappearance. In fact, nobody was really allowed to talk about it. Nobody talked about it. It was like she just vanished into thin air. Her family and her close friends, like the friends from school, they would go down to the police department and they would say, "What are you doing?" In fact, they themselves went, and like little detectives, they went and gathered The day after they realized that Kathleen didn't make it to school, they went to her house, their house, and they took the trash. And they saw that the day after Kathleen was reported missing, Robert was already discarding her clothes and her mail. And they even found a piece of paper that seemed to be a sort of alibi list. Like, he had a list of things that he was to say happened, and that was all in the trash. And one of Kathleen's best friends who rode the train often said that she was on that train for like a week straight. And she asked regulars, did you see her on this train this night? Did you see her? And I guess back then, you know, people knew each other. That kind of train ride was a very common thing. There were regulars, and nobody remembered seeing Kathleen. The only person that stated at the time that they had definitely seen Kathleen enter her apartment that night was the security guard at the residence. Obviously, they're very wealthy people. They have security guards. And he said, yes, I did see her enter the apartment. Well, it is later found out that he was drinking on the job. He was nervous because he said, well, Robert said she arrived at the apartment safely. And if Mr. Durst said this, he's like, I was drunk, I was drinking on the job, I would often leave. I just kind of went with what Mr. Durst said. So he claims to have seen her the day after enter one of their Manhattan apartments. Even though he was kind of drunk at the time, he did say to investigators, he's like, I saw her, I know I saw her enter the apartment. And they kind of pushed the issue. They said, well, are you certain that you saw her? And now we know that he didn't see her at all. But at the time he said, well, I saw her from behind. I recognized her from behind, like her coat, her hair, her jacket sort of thing. So that was allegedly a spotting of her. So at that time, she wasn't necessarily a missing person. The detectives were saying, this is Robert Durst. This is a very powerful man. He's not going to do something to his wife. He also claimed that on February 4th, the supervisor at her medical school called him and said that she had called in sick on February 1st. This is another reason why red flags weren't immediately thrown up with the police, because there were people at her school saying that she herself had called in and said she was sick and wasn't going to be going to school for a while. That's where Susan Berman kind of comes in. So this basically bought them more time. Them meaning possibly Robert and possibly Susan Berman, because it's strongly insinuated, it's strongly believed that Susan Berman is the one that did this. Susan Berman knew so many things about Bob. She trusted him and he trusted her. And the reason that she really liked him, by the way, was because she said that he reminded her of her father. And her father, I think, had been assassinated or something. But you know, he was a crime boss and he was important and people feared him, and Bob sort of reminded her of her father, and she really respected Bob. She really did. And I think they had a true friendship. There wasn't really any indication of foul play. The detectives said people disappeared all the time. It was rumored that she was off shacking up with another man. And it wasn't until she didn't return to her studies, which everybody really knew that she wanted to be a doctor. That's when people were really starting to get alarmed. And that's when Robert felt compelled to file a missing persons report. And to this day, nobody has been charged in her disappearance. A lot of people believe Robert did it. But because of the police work back then, like the 70s, the 80s, DNA wasn't a big thing. Nobody even checked the house at that time to look for clues. Nobody looked at the lake. Years later, they did go look at the lake, and they kind of got excited because they found death. I think cadaver dogs found death or something like that. But all they found was a dead animal, and it was probably one of the dogs, one of the 7 Iggers. So while the police weren't investigating this as something of foul play right immediately, her friends were. Like I said, they would go down to the police station and harass them basically, and they brought the garbage, and suddenly they started to find things out on top of the list of a sort of alibi, if you will, which again is just circumstantial evidence, and the fact that he was throwing away her mail. It's almost like he knew she was never coming back. So one of the detectives started to really think about this and was like, okay, something's amiss here. And then he found out that 3 weeks prior to Kathleen's disappearance, she had been treated at the hospital for facial bruises. She had told one of her friends that Robert had beat her, yet she did not press charges over the incident, of course. She was very protective of the bad parts of the relationship. And that is something, again, I can completely relate to in previous relationships. It's almost like you feel ashamed and you feel like it's gonna get better. And so when it does get better, you don't want your friends to have this hatred toward your spouse that you want to be with for the rest of your life. You just have this ideology that it's gonna get better, so why muddy the waters of the conception that your friends might have? Why let them have a bias? But they were smart girls. They knew better, and her brother knew better too. On top of that, the police found out that Kathleen McCormick had asked for a divorce. Like, they didn't know all of these things right away. When she went missing, they had no idea of any of these things. All they thought was that they had a couple marital issues and that she was shacking it up with some young hot stud doctor and doing cocaine. So she had asked for a $250,000 divorce settlement. And like I said, the way the money was tied up, that was impossible. And so after she went to his office and found incriminating documents, sort of, I guess, I don't know if what she was going to do was to try and blackmail him, but it was basically to give him encouragement to give her what she needed. And she wasn't asking for much, considering the $888 million family estate. She really just wanted to complete doctor school. She wanted to be a pediatric doctor, get married to someone that actually wanted to have children, and just live a life that she deserved. And that was stolen from her. And also the police found out that after she had asked for this divorce settlement, Robert immediately canceled her credit cards, like I said. He stopped paying for her tuition. He removed her name from their joint bank account. And also, for 3 years prior to this, like I said, it wasn't uncommon for them not to be in the same apartment together. He had 2 apartments, and he, at the time, was living on and off with the woman he was having the affair with, the woman who was also married, who was Prudence. So of course, Durst had to play the, oh my God, my wife's missing, that husband sort of that part. And he did. He put out a reward for $100,000 for anyone that had any information regarding her disappearance, her whereabouts, what had happened to her. But it wasn't even a month later, I believe, and to where he lowered that $100,000 reward to $15,000. Only 3 weeks after reporting her missing, he was seen discarding his wife's possessions, and that was by her best friends. It was like he knew she was never going to return. I keep going through this thing in my head when I learn about Robert Durst's life, even things that come from his own mouth. I believe he's a very intelligent man, but he did some really stupid things that if he hadn't done, people wouldn't have suspected. You know what I mean? They wouldn't suspect him to this day to be responsible for her disappearance. It's like he was so confident. He always believed he was smarter than everybody else. And he always believed that he was never given justice. In fact, I did forget to mention, one of the things that really bothered him also was not only that his father made him come back to New York to work with him and stop his health food store in Vermont, which he wanted, he also was the oldest. So naturally, in the hierarchy, in even biblical terms, this goes back to biblical times, if that's what you believe in, the older son takes over the family business. But they had such little confidence in him that they gave his brother his position. So essentially, Robert was supposed to be heir to the throne of the Durst companies, if you will. He didn't get that, and that really bothered him. So he always had this sense of injustice, like he was just wronged all the time. People were wronging him left and right. They wrongly accused him of, his wife's disappearance. He was wrongly taken out of the family, business, the title that he deserved. He just always felt slighted because of her friends that continued to push the police. They continued to go down there. They kept asking Bob things, and finally Bob lawyered up. And the detectives really thought that was suspicious. They were like, why would you lawyer up when your wife is missing? Why wouldn't you answer every single question you possibly can if you truly want your wife to be found? You're this husband, you love your wife, she's a beautiful young lady, blah, blah, blah. They found it weird. And every question went through his attorney, and his attorney often said, we're not going to answer those questions. We don't have to. Because there were no formal charges ever brought upon anybody in regard to the disappearance of Kathleen McCormick, who is still missing to this day. So 8 years after her disappearance, he filed for a thing called spousal abandonment, and because of that, he was granted an official divorce in 1990. So as of 1990, he was officially divorced from her. So after he formally obtained the divorce, he did move in to an apartment or a house with another woman whose name is Deborah Lee Charton, and she did end up becoming his second wife. They got married December 11th, 2000. It's always been said that she was a marriage of convenience, and you'll know why in just a little bit, just a couple seconds. According to the New York Times, the couple briefly shared a Fifth Avenue apartment in 1990. But after they were married, they never lived together as husband and wife. As of today, Deborah Lee lives with one of Durst's lawyers, Stephen Holm. So meanwhile, Robert continued to work for the family business. He didn't do the best job, but he did work for them. And then he had a falling out with his siblings. He spent much of the 1990s drifting around the country, briefly reappearing around the time of his father's death in 1995. So something happened at the end of 2000 that made prosecutors want to reopen the Kathleen McCormick disappearance. They wanted to find out what happened, and there was a prosecutor that strongly believed that Robert Durst had something to do with it, and she was determined to get to the bottom of it. So they began to question friends and family, and keep in mind at this point it's been, I think it had been like 20 years since Kathleen's disappearance. And so many people kept bringing up the name Susan Berman to the investigators, to the prosecutors. And during this time, Susan was going through some money issues. And allegedly she had called Bob and said, I need money, this and that. And I think Bob was kind of hesitant. Like, after all these years, he was kind of sick, I think, of being just like the money bags to her. That same token, she was sort of like his secret keeper. And it is alleged that at one point she said, you know what, there is a reporter and a detective that want to question me about Kathleen. In December, I believe, she did end up getting about $50,000 from Robert. I think it was in two separate $25,000 envelopes, checks, if you will, sent to her Beverly Hills home. Now, in one of the letters, specifically one of the envelopes, he misspelled the word Beverly. He added an extra E, and he tended to write in a block sort of style, capital letters. That'll be significant later. Shortly after receiving the $50,000 from Robert Durst and him finding out, because it was in the papers, that this investigation was getting reopened, on December 24th, 2000, Susan Berman was found murdered in her home by a single gunshot wound to the head, execution style. Now, the reason that she was found was because the police department received an anonymous letter that had their address on the envelope, right? And inside, I believe there was a note, a handwritten note, and it said cadaver, and it had her address. Now, that didn't really mean anything at the time. It was weird. It was very weird. That's all it said. And so that's how they found her body. And it is thought to believe, they were thinking that the person that killed her obviously knew her, because there were no signs of break-in into the house, which would mean that she allowed the person to come inside. And also the fact that the murderer contacted the police, almost in a way that they cared enough about her that they did not want her body to just sit there and rot and not be properly buried. That's what is believed. Now, Robert had an alibi at the time. Of course, they immediately thought about him. At this point, a lot of people did not like this man, including his family. His family even got restraining orders against him because he was just bizarre. He was very butthurt about the fact that his family, you know, didn't let him take over the family business, and he was just so eccentric. He was so weird, and he would just disappear. He declined to be further questioned about the murder of Susan Berman. Now, Susan Berman also was an alibi. Like I said, when the papers, when Kathleen first went missing, the papers bombarded Robert Durst with questions. And he was not a people person. Remember, I said in the very beginning, he didn't like people, and people didn't really like him, and he didn't really know how to handle them. And because Susan Berman was a writer, and she did work for the Times once in a while, and she just knew people. She wasn't necessarily rich, but she kind of was really good at inserting herself into that lifestyle. So she knew a lot of people. And she became the go-to spokesperson for Robert Durst when Kathleen was missing at the very beginning. And like I said, she knew a lot, and she dealt with Robert, and we don't know what secrets they exchanged with each other. But it is very suspicious, and the police also thought so, that around the time that they were getting ready to question her regarding Kathleen's disappearance and what she possibly knew, she ends up murdered. And it is actually said, I believe on record, that her biggest fear was to be shot in the head. After all of this happened, during the year 2000, Robert Durst had moved to Texas. After he heard that they were going to reopen the case regarding his missing wife, before Susan Berman's murder, he moved to Galveston, Texas. And he went under another alias. And he began to dress as a woman, a mute woman, because he thought that the problem with him and the media was that he was Robert Durst, and he needed to get away from that identity. He didn't want to be that anymore. He never really wanted to be Robert Durst. And so he decided that the best way to disguise himself was to be a woman. And so he would dress up as a woman. And I believe he went under the name of Dorothy in an attempt to hide from the media and to get away from all of it. I guess there's a little town, Galveston. Apparently that's where a lot of people just go to disappear. So he had this neighbor named Morris Black, and Morris, I think, was 70-something years old at the time. According to Robert, he started to complain about his noise, like that Robert was making too much noise. And then he let Morris Black know that he was a mute woman. I guess he wrote it down or something. But eventually they became close friends. Eventually they would, you know, he lost the disguise. He kind of told him, like, you know what? I'm Robert Durst. I'm running from my identity. I just want to get away from who I am. I just want to live my life and not be hounded by the media and accused. And everywhere he looked, he was either accused of murdering Susan Berman or he was accused of murdering his wife, Kathleen. And so they became close friends, according to Robert. Oh, and he also insinuated that Morris Black had guns, and it's really weird because there's not a lot of photographs of Morris Black. There's not really much known about this man, except for that he lived there. He was a neighbor. And allegedly, one day, Morris Black received an eviction notice, and he was really pissed off, and he had a gun. And Robert said that they were in his apartment. I guess they were watching a show or something. They were watching sports, maybe. And they were under the influence, I think he said, Jack Daniels and marijuana. And he heard a gunshot, and allegedly Morris Black shot the eviction notice. And Robert was like, you need to leave. You're not welcome here. You're scaring me. I am fearful. What I'm telling you right now is what was told in court. I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm so sorry, you guys. So in 2001, not even a year, but like a year after Susan Berman was murdered, police divers found a headless torso in the Galveston River, and they found other body parts in bags, like a full leg, basically a dismembered body. And they were able to identify the body by a fingerprint left on one of the hands, and they identified the body as Morris Black. Morris Black happened to be Robert Durst, aka Dorothy's neighbor. So they start investigating, they find out where he lives, talk to the guy that owned the building. And they found out that this Dorothy woman was ugly. She was a mute, ugly woman. The guy said she had a very flat chest, but she traveled a lot, and she paid a year ahead in advance for rent. And the police were starting to just question this. They were puzzled. They're like, why would this woman live in this dump, yet have enough money to always be traveling to pay her rent in advance? It just didn't make any sense to them. So they get a warrant, they go into the apartment, and they discover that nothing inside the apartment indicates the woman lives there. Nothing. And then they discover that, in fact, a man named Robert Durst lives there, a man who was posing as Dorothy. So they arrest him on charges of suspected homicide of Morris Black, and they book him, and they tell him that he is being charged with murder, first-degree murder, and he has a $200,000 bail. All the detectives, by the way, said that, how could this guy have dismembered a body? He looks like a librarian. It's like a quote. At this time in Galveston, Texas, they had no idea who Robert Durst was, like back in New York. They had no idea how powerful his family was, not until the next day. So like I said, Robert asked the detective, what should I do? And the detective is like, well, do you have $200,000? And Robert says to him, not on me. The detective found that very weird. He's like, who answers a question like that? Not on me? And sure enough, he calls his wife at the time, Deborah, and says, I need bail money. And the next day he is set free and he's out on bail. They were like, wait a second, who is this? So then the New York Times finds out about this Morris Black man's death, his murder, dismemberment of his body, and that it is Robert Durst. And they're like, this isn't our Robert Durst. Everybody was like, what the fuck? Seriously? So they put two and two together, and it's all over the news. It's all over the news. So he obviously became the prime suspect of the 2001 murder of Morris Black. He was brought into trial in 2003. So he says that basically they had that altercation. Morris had shot at the eviction notice, and basically Robert took the gun from him or something like that, shot him out of self-defense. He said he dismembered his body because he's like, the entire reason I was in Galveston, Texas to begin with was because I was trying to get away from everything that was following me back in New York and Manhattan, my old life. He's like, I just wanted to get away from it. And he said, nobody would believe me that I killed him in self-defense. It was either me or him. And in Texas, apparently, if you are in your own home and somebody threatens you, I guess, I don't know if this is true, I don't live in Texas, you can shoot somebody. You can take matters into your own hands, and if you have a weapon, a gun, you can kill someone if they are trying to kill you. So he did. And he said the reason that he dismembered him was because, well, he wasn't gonna leave the body there. First of all, he couldn't move the body. It was too heavy. And nobody would believe him. If he went to the police, the authorities, nobody was going to believe that Robert Durst, who is suspected of 2 other murders, you know, of his wife Kathleen and Susan Berman, nobody is going to believe that it was self-defense. So he freaked. And I guess he ended up buying like a hacksaw and all of this stuff. And basically he dismembered the body, threw it in the water, and it was found.
Durst admitted to shooting his neighbor in self-defense, then cutting his body up before tossing the pieces into the bay.
So he gets to trial, and I think he spent $1.8 million in attorney fees. He had 2 of the best attorneys. He couldn't decide which one, so he hired them both. When the jury came back, I think they deliberated for 6 days. They were instructed. They said, you are to judge him based off of if he killed Morris Black in self-defense. You are not to judge him based off of what happened to the body afterward. That is for another time and place. That was the jury instruction. And I guess even out of the 12 jury members, only 3 ever thought that he was guilty. So he was acquitted.
With the jury, find the defendant, Robert Durst, not guilty.
He was acquitted of murder in 2003, sentenced to 5 years for evidence tampering and bond jumping.
He was acquitted of murder, even though he admitted to dismembering his neighbor Morris. So you would think this man would lay low, would keep a low profile. My God, he has dodged so many bullets. Whether or not he is guilty of the Kathleen situation, her disappearance, or Susan Berman, it's all very suspicious. You would think this man would keep a low profile. So in between these things, there's so much to this story, but like in between this, so he was arrested on October 9th, 2001 for the murder. Then he was let out. So on October 16th, he missed a court hearing, okay? And Robert said, listen, he was for sure, he was certain, I'm so sorry, I'm all over the place, but I told you this is a mess, there's so much. He was certain that he was going to be convicted of murder. And he's like, I wasn't going to show up to court. Bye-bye $200,000. Bye-bye. I don't care. I'm leaving. I'm going to, you know. So this is how dumb this guy is. So on October 16th, he misses his court hearing. He bail jumps, basically. And there is a warrant issued for his arrest. Obviously, because this is a murder. I mean, obviously. So on November 30th, he is caught at a grocery store. I believe it is called a Wegmans supermarket in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. He tried to shoplift. I believe first he took some Band-Aids out of a box and put them in his pocket. I think he's actually seen on surveillance tape. And then he tries to shoplift a chicken sandwich. The thing about this is he had, I think it was like over $500 on his person at the time in his pocket and over $37,000 in his trunk. Either he's the dumbest person in the world, or again, so narcissistic to believe that he can literally get away with anything. Because guess what? So far, if he had anything to do with Kathleen and Susan, he had gotten away with murder. You know what I mean? So you would think that a man that's jumping bail for another murder, for an actual murder trial, would be on the DL. Why wouldn't you pay for your chicken sandwich? You have the money. You have the means to. What are you doing? This is what I mean. This man is an anomaly. Nobody probably understands him. So he gets arrested, and inside the car, not only does he have the $37,000 cash, marijuana, he has Morris Black's driver's license, by the way. He has directions to the Connecticut home of Gilbert Najami, a former confidant of McCormick who had dodged Durst for years, publicizing accusations he had murdered his wife. So one of Kathleen's friends, who was always in the papers accusing him of murdering Kathleen, he had directions to his house, and 2 guns, which you can only kind of imagine what he was planning to do. During this time, he also used this time to stalk his brother Douglas, visiting the driveway of his home in Katona, New York, while armed. He was arrested. He was eventually extradited for his Texas trial. A lot of people believe that he was going to fight that extradition, but he didn't. So like I said, in 2003, he was tried for the murder. That is why, even though he was acquitted of murder, he still was sentenced to 5 years because of the bail jumping. That's why he got that sentence. But this guy's crazy. He just continued to do things that would harm his own defense, his own self. In 2004, he did plead guilty to 2 counts of bail jumping and 1 count of evidence tampering. As part of a plea bargain, he received a sentence of 5 years and was given credit for time served, requiring him to serve 3 years in prison. So the rules of his release required him to stay near his home. Permission was required to travel. That December, Durst made an unauthorized trip to the boarding house where Black had been killed and to a nearby shopping mall. At the mall, he ran into former Galveston trial judge, the judge, Susan Chris, who had presided over his trial. This guy. Due to this incident, the Texas Board of Pardons and Paroles determined that Durst had violated the terms of his release, or his parole. And on March 2006, he was returned to jail. And then on March 1st, 2006, he was released again. So, I'm going to end this part right here because this is a lot to take in. Basically, those are the 3 really big things that he did. There were other petty crimes that he did, like he urinated, I believe, in a CVS Houston store on a rack of candy, which he later pleaded guilty to criminal mischief. In July 2014, he was arrested after turning himself into police following an incident. Oh yeah, the CVS incident. His attorneys argued that it was a medical condition. It was an unfortunate medical mishap. So, part 2, we're going to delve into the movies that were made about him, the docuseries, and sort of where he's at now. So, on that note, thank you guys so much for watching of this crazy case. I love you guys so much. Please turn on your notification. I'm going through a lot right now. No excuses, but truly, the fact that I filmed this video is a miracle. Thank you so much for watching. If you were interested, if you've seen the videos, the movies, the docuseries, let me know what you think in the comments down below. Obviously, I know how this is. I know what happens next. So maybe just let me know if you are familiar with the case. Let's not spoil it for anyone else yet. I love you guys so much. And please remember to always be kind to yourself and others, especially yourself. It's really hard sometimes for me to take my own advice. But I'm very lucky to have some pretty cool people that I can talk to. You know who you are. So yeah, I love you guys so much, and I will see you in my next video, which will be very, very soon. Mwah. Bye.
But he's never told his side of the story until now. And we are joined now by the director, Andrew Jarecki. The new documentary is called The Jinx.
And she was very outgoing and social. You got along with people real good. So it was perfect, because I don't get along with people. Most people don't get along with me.